Hello my friends, welcome back to my channel. Okay, hello, welcome back. I missed a week of the weekly reading updates because I was quite ill, but I'm doing okay now, so we're gonna do a weekly reading wrap-up, weekly reading update for 2 weeks. So these videos are my new favorite thing, where I just take you through what I have read through the week, what I'm currently reading, and what I hope to read next. And I just enjoy these videos so much, and I'm really happy that you all seem to be enjoying them too. So let's go ahead and get into it. This is also actually kind of going to be pretty much like a mid-month wrap-up because it is already, like, you know, 2 weeks into July. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the first book that I want to talk about that I finished is An Earl to Remember by Stacy Reid. So Stacy Reid is a freaking queen. Like, she's one of my favorite authors. I just love how she writes historical romances. I love her romances. I love everything about it. I like how bonkers her plots are and how I'm like, yeah, makes sense. Okay. Yeah. I think she has a really good grasp of storytelling and especially creating chemistry, and she's just fantastic. I just love and adore her. All that being said, this is an arc. It doesn't come out until August, so I'm not going to be spoiling the plot, but I am going to give you my star rating and my total feelings. So if you don't want to know anything at all about this book, fast forward to the next one. So I ended up giving this book a 4-star rating on Goodreads, but I feel like it's more of like a 3.5 for me. And honestly, it pains me to rate this book that low, because this is one of my favorite authors. But this book was, while not entirely a miss, it was a bit disappointing. The first book in the series, A Matter of Temptation, is absolutely fantastic. Like, seriously. If you have not read A Matter of Temptation, you need to, because it's one of my favorite historical romances. So this is the second book in that series, and we actually do meet this hero in the first book. We see him. He is a rake in every sense of the word, like a man whore 100%, like, for sure. And I didn't realize that was who this character was going to be, but that's typically my least favorite type of hero. Honestly, I would rather have an alpha hole than just a man whore. Like, I find them so just unlikable, you know. But I will say I am always here for good character development, and to get good character development, sometimes you have to start out with heroes or heroines that you really don't like. So I think he did have good character development. So the basic premise of this is essentially an overboard retelling where the heroine, her parents have died, and she's trying to keep this crumbling estate going and raise her younger sisters. And so she's trying to get work to earn money to have a living, and she wants to be a cook and a chef, and she's exceptionally talented at that. So she ends up getting a job on this yacht, which is the Earl's yacht, and she's going to cook there, and it's going to really give her some much needed income. So she goes to cook on this yacht, and has, you know, she sees the Earl across the room, and they like lock eyes and they have a moment, and it's just like chemistry sparking everywhere, you know. And then later on they meet again in private, sort of run into each other, not knowing, he doesn't know that she's the cook. He believes her to be one of the ladies who's coming to have liaisons with him that night, and he kisses her and starts touching her, and she very much responds. And then he finally finds out when his mistress comes in that this is actually not one of the women they were going to have a party with that night, but she's actually the cook. The mistress demands that he fire her. He sends her off the ship. She's very upset, obviously, because she missed out on work and the money. And then in an argument that the mistress and the Earl have, she ends up pushing him overboard. He washes up on the shore where the heroine lives, and his memory is completely gone. So the heroine sort of walks in while he's, you know, doesn't know who he is, and he remembers her. He remembers touching her, feeling things for her, and he blurts something out like, "We know each other carnally." And the heroine is like, "Oh my gosh, you're going to ruin me." And so she sort of like fumbles and says, "Well, actually, we're married." So she says that they're married. They're not. And thus he proceeds to believe that this is his wife, and he goes to live with her at her crumbling estate. And when they get to her estate and watching the Earl really sort of fall in love with her younger sisters and, you know, learn how to work for like the first time in his life, and the development that he had in his character right there was so beautiful, and I really, really loved that part. But then once he gets his memory back and things start happening again, he sort of reverts back to the man that he was. And there was a moment right towards the end, wasn't quite a third act conflict, where he makes a choice that really disappointed me, and I was hoping for more from this hero, from a hero, but specifically at the end of a romance where I expect the hero to have at least grown and matured a little bit. I didn't feel like he ever really did. And yeah, that was pretty disappointing to me. I struggled with a lot of this book. But I don't think it's a bad book. I would still recommend it, but it's nowhere near as good as any of the other Stacey Reads that I have read, and so therefore it was a little disappointing. Mostly my disappointment hinges on when he gets his memories back and some of the things that he does, some of his behavior, some of the way he treats the heroine, and what he asks her to do and things like that. I just didn't love that entirely, so I don't think this is a bad book by any means. I mean, those were very much personal issues where I'm just like, oh, I didn't love that. I wish that had been different, you know, like, because I was hoping it would be, and it wasn't. So not a bad book at all, but definitely disappointing. So 3.5 rounded up to 4 on Goodreads. Moving on. Okay, so the next book that I read is right here, Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. I bought myself this for my birthday in May because I'd been hearing some things about it. I've been hearing about this author for quite a while, that she has written adult fantasy that's really beautiful that I also want to get to ASAP. I have A River Enchanted, I think. Is that what it is? I have that book and I want to read it right away. So I'd been hearing this was a really great fantasy romance, and I was like, say less, I'm very interested, so I bought it for my birthday and it's just been sitting there. I finally decided to cave and buy the audiobook. I don't know why I continue to buy more than one version of a book. I don't know why, especially when I haven't read the book. Like, that's the thing that gets me. It's like, Crystal, stop doing that. But I bought the audiobook with an Audible credit, and the audiobook was fantastic, really great narration. And I ended up really enjoying this. I did give this 4 out of 5 stars. It wasn't quite a hit for me, but this is technically a YA fantasy romance, but it doesn't feel young at all. Like, this to me, this is the type of YA fantasy that could very much transcend into older readers. Like, the feeling in here of the characters feels very universal and very appealing to readers of all ages. The fantasy world in here is very, very lightly depicted. It's just sort of hinted at. This is what I would almost call this magical realism, because the world is so hazy and not really defined. There are gods in here, warring gods, and there's war because of the gods. But it's all very like a hazy world building concept. And for me, my personal enjoyment, unless it is like specifically magical realism, where that's more of like an exploration of the themes and the magical elements are going to drive that theme home. I'm a very, very much a theme-driven reader. I love, love, love themes authors are working with. And I love that about magical realism, because while it is like set solidly in our real world, there are magical elements to it that really sort of can help the author play with those themes and deliver them to the reader in a really interesting and unique and thought-provoking way. So I feel like this to me, this feels a little bit more like that, because there are magical elements in here that aren't fully explained, like the typewriter. The typewriter in here, actually how they write letters, I know I haven't told you what it's about yet. It's very magical. Like, there's not really a ton of explanation given to it. It's just sort of exists, and they end up writing these letters to each other. So, okay. 4 stars. Let me tell you about this book. So, the basic premise of this book is the heroine, I believe her name is Iris, right? Iris and Roman. Iris is the heroine, and her brother has gone into the war. Her mother is an alcoholic, and she's like working as a columnist for this paper, where she is in a rivalry with this other writer, this Roman, the other writer, and they're both like fighting for a position at the paper, and she's desperate for it because, you know, her mother is very irresponsible financially, and she's trying to survive, whereas Roman comes from what appears to be like a very privileged upper-class family, and they're sort of trying to arrange a marriage for him. Let me see if I can move this so the sun's not quite in my eyes. Is that better? I don't think that's better. They're trying to basically get an arranged marriage for him and have good connections and things like that. So it feels a little bit historical in that way. So they're both fighting for this columnist position, and they're very much like rivals with each other. And so in her moments when she's alone and she's at home, she ends up writing these letters to her brother in the war on this typewriter of her grandmother's. And when she was a girl, she would slide the letters under the door to give to her grandmother, and her grandmother would write back. So she writes these letters to her brother, never intending to send them, just sort of almost like journaling her feelings and expressing her feelings, and she slides it under the door. And then actually somebody writes back and slides it back under the door. She doesn't realize who is doing doing that, it's Roman who's writing the letters. So they have like this magical way to communicate with one another, and she doesn't know who he is, and he does know who she is. So even though they're like rivals in real life, like he's starting to develop feelings for her because of the letters that they're writing to one another. So really beautiful premise, really, really beautiful, really expertly written. Just the prose in this is so stunning. The prose in this is absolutely beautiful. There were parts of this that as I was listening to the audio, that I wanted to mark and highlight, but I did not because I don't even know. I'm disappointed in myself. But a lot of this book has some sort of commentary on writing and the act of writing and how that affects humans and their souls, and just like how that enhances life. And it was just beautifully done. If you've written at all, if you're any type of a writer, if you have an interest in writing and not just fiction, I think you would really enjoy this book because of the emphasis on writing and how important that is to humans in this world. And I loved the romance. It was very, very slow building, slow developing. There is an intimate scene in here, but it is not like explicit or anything like that. I loved their romance. I thought it was very, very lovely. The only reason I gave this 4 out of 5 stars was really because I really wanted the world to be fleshed out a little bit more. And if it wasn't going to be fleshed out more, I wanted the themes to be more developed or more expanded or explored, and I didn't feel like either of those were working really to what I wanted personally. So for me, if you're going to have like hazy world building and you're going to have an emphasis on theme, I need that theme to be strong. If you're not going to really do theme and it's just going to be like a very fun, engaging fantasy book, then I need the world to be strong. So that's my personal barometer on how I feel about fantasy world building. I want one or the other of those. I don't ever want both. I don't want a lack of world building and no theme. I don't want it to be deliberately hazy world and the theme not to be explored enough in a way that really drives home the concept here. So, I don't know. I really enjoyed it. I think it's beautifully written. I think it's very sensitive. I really liked the romance, but it was just slightly underwhelming for me on the way that the theme in the world didn't quite feel like it was hitting home hard enough in a way that I personally wanted it to. Okay, the next book that I read is Wildland, Wild Love by Connie Mason. Now, to be completely fair, I'm not giving this book a rating. There was a great portion of this book that I skim read, mostly because this book very heavily relies on steam, and there were portions of this book that were depicting the indigenous people. It's set in Australia in a way that I personally really didn't enjoy, even though, look, I don't want to hear any arguments, and not that my lovely viewers would, but occasionally people come on my videos and they hear me talk about things like this, like certain representation, and then they get all upset about it, and I'm just saying, like, I understand it's an older book, I really do. But again, I am rating this book on my personal enjoyment, and I don't find that enjoyable. So I'm not giving it a star rating because I don't feel good about giving a book a star rating if I didn't fully 100% read all of the pages, and I did skip over quite a lot of this book. But I will say I wasn't a huge fan of this author's storytelling. This feels very much like, it's almost like a pulpy book where it's very much adventure based. This is basically about a heroine who is, you know, the romance is between her and this ex-convict, and it's set in Australia, and so it's sort of like adventure-based in that way, very, very heavily steam-driven, but really a lack of any type of chemistry or connection between the two of them, and in that way I feel like this fits very, very much into the niche of romances that were being written sort of alongside the adventure books that were being written for men, like adventure, sex, but very little else, you know? So I didn't love this one. I'm not going to give it a star rating. I read this for the Historical Hellions live show I was supposed to be on, but I was, you know, out of commission for a little while and had some medical tests that I need to do that night, so I wasn't able to go on the live show, which disappoints me because I was hoping we could have a really good discussion about that one. So, okay, now the next book that I read is How to Tame a Wild Rogue by Julianne Long. So I think this is book 6 in her Palace of Rogues series. I've read one other book in the series. I've read them out of order. This book was fantastic. I gave this book 6 stars. I freaking loved it. I thought it was so much fun. I feel like this is peak historical romance. Just enough banter and witty dialogue and witty commentary from like the different perspectives and points of view to really get me like satisfied and being like, I love clever, witty writing so much. Not so much that I would call this a rom-com, but just enough to be like, that's clever. Like, that's a good line. You know, like and it's all in how the characters are portrayed on the page and their interactions with the other characters. Like, I think Julianne Long is an incredible writer. I love her historical romances. This one is definitely my favorite of hers that I have ever read, and I thought it was fantastic. The basic premise of this book comes out the end of July, I believe. I'm not entirely sure. I'll put the date on the screen when this book comes out. It does come out in July. And I will say that I read this book not really knowing the background for the Palace of Rogues series, and I still deeply enjoyed it. But there are certain moments with characters where they have their own points of view in here. Not a lot, but they do have them, that I know I was missing information from not having read, like, books 1 and 2 in the series, right? So I do think you can read this out of order, because I did, and I wasn't really finding it lacking to not have the context of the other characters that were mentioned. But if you want, like, the whole experience, just read the whole series. And actually, I'll mention that I went back to read book 1 after I finished this book. So we have Lorcan and Daphne. So Lorcan is a privateer. He's a former pirate, and he's very, very wealthy and doing really well, but he's still very much like a privateer, a bit of a scoundrel in that way. Like, he's not the type of man that is going to be readily accepted into the upper crust of society, but he's fine with that. He's fine with who he is. So the Palace of Rogues is basically like a boarding house that sits around the River Thames in London, and it's supposed to be like this respite where people go to just like relax, and it's almost like a family type of effect there. So that's the setting. They're in this dockside town in London, and Lorcan's walking by and he sees this woman climbing out of her window, and she's about to fall. And him being the gallant man that he is, he's like, hey, I'll catch you, just, drop right now, I got you. So she trusts him and she falls into his arms, and then they end up at the Palace of Rogues when this terrible storm is coming in where they're going to be underwater, basically. So they end up staying at the Palace of Rogues together under the guise of husband and wife, because he rescued her from falling out of this window for plot reasons. She was trying to earn money. She's the daughter of an Earl, or no, she's the daughter of a Viscount, and she's trying to earn money to support her family because her father has squandered it because he gambled it all away. So she's working as a governess in this room, and the man of the house, tried to assault her, basically. She gets away and tries to shimmy down the drain. So now she finds herself sharing a room with Lorcan, who she's very much attracted to, and he's very much attracted to her as well. And they're posing as husband and wife. And it was just so charming. This is a book where very little happens plot-wise, but a lot happens within their hotel room and with our couple together. And it's just so delightful. The dialogue, the banter, the chemistry, everything about it was just so fun. This is one of the most fun historical romances I've read in a really long time. I enjoyed the heck out of it. I thought it was fantastic. Great, 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 great. Can't say enough good things about it. If you are looking for just a really fun, immersive historical romance, I cannot recommend this one more. It was so fantastic. I adored it. Okay, now the next book that I read is Getting Schooled by Christina C. Jones. I wanted something shorter to listen to on audio after I had just finished Divine Rivals, and this is a short audiobook. It's only 5 hours. This is one of Christina C. Jones' books that I've actually heard a lot about. I feel like a lot of people have read it, and that's kind of why I put off reading it, because I cannot help approaching books that a lot of people have read and reviewed with a certain mindset, and it's really hard for me to get around that and not let that affect my opinion of the book or how I am perceiving it as I'm reading it. So this book was very fun. I gave it 4 stars. The narration was excellent. Christina C. Jones is such a solid writer. She has such a gift for writing great characters, great dialogue, funny, witty moments, just excellent situations. I just love it. All of her writing, it just feels so natural. It's the type of writing style that's just very easy to just get lost and swept away in. I just love her book so much. So that's why I picked this one up, because I was hoping for that type of reading experience, and it completely delivered. So this is basically about our heroine, who is a grad student, and she's working as an assistant to her mother, who's the professor of this literature class at college, and she ends up finding these essays or going through and grading them. And one of them really strikes her eye because it's from a man who has a very feminist point of view and commentary on the books that they're reading. And she's like, what? She's very intrigued with that. And I loved their dialogue, their conversation about literature and things in books and fiction. And I just my nerd brain was just having a great time about that. I loved it so freaking much. And they end up meeting in person. They have a little bit of a tiff. They don't instantly mesh. Their personalities are kind of at odds, but their chemistry is super, super high. And then, of course, they end up falling in love, and first of all, they end up falling in bed, and then they end up falling in love, and it was just really, really fun. The hero has a disability. He is missing a leg, and I thought that was really beautiful, really well done. Just it was a great, if you're looking for a disability in romance, I would highly recommend this one. It is Disability Pride Month, so it was fantastic. The only reason it was 4 instead of 5 stars is that I felt like the time frame or the jump from lust to love was a little unrealistic and a little rushed, so I didn't really love that. But other than that, it was absolutely fun and grossing. I adored it. Okay, now the next book that I read is The Only One Left by Riley Sager. I was disappointed with this book. I don't even really want to talk about it that much. This book took me a freaking week to read. I listened to it on audio. It took me forever. I felt like this book dragged. I was so freaking bored while I was reading this. I was so freaking bored. I was bored. I don't even remember the last time I've been this bored by a book. I don't even know. I had this big TBR of books that I wanted to read for Summerween, and this is the only one I got through. And let me tell you, I didn't even really like it. And now I'm like, give me my romances, give me my fantasy books. I don't like it. So the premise of this one is basically our heroine, she had a situation with a client. She's like a caretaker. She had a situation with one of her patients who ended up overdosing on pills that she had kind of left out. And so she's really having a hard time finding a job. She ends up finding one and getting hired because nobody else wants to take it at this mansion up on a cliff with this older woman who is the only survivor of her family. And it's assumed that she killed the members of her family and she's the only one left, but the police couldn't prove it. So there's this whole mystery, obviously, a mystery surrounding this book of, did she actually kill all these people? What actually happened that night? And what's happening with our heroine? Did she leave the pills out? Like, are they connected? All of these questions throughout the whole book. But like, this book, just moved very, very slowly. There was very little that was sort of like pulling you along the plot to sort of get you those answers. Like, I think the most effective thrillers for me, or mysteries, is when it sort of gives you a little tiny clue, but not the full clue. And so you're like, oh, well maybe this, and then you keep like going and getting more and more. So your intrigue is very high because you're like, what is the answer? Like, how is this going to be solved? And this didn't really have that. It felt like a series of just like backstory. This book felt like a lot of telling. Like, there was a lot of telling. Even the reveal at the end came through, and it was literally just monologue. People talking, people telling, this is what happened, and this is why I did this. And I just hate that. This book didn't feel clever. It didn't feel unique. This felt like every other Riley Sager book that I've ever read before. This is genre fiction, so I expect there to be certain beats in thrillers, but even then, and even with an author that I've read before, in romance, where I feel like I'm very familiar with their story beats, my favorite authors can really present them in a very fresh, satisfying way that doesn't make me feel like I've read this a million times and I'm bored, This book just felt too reminiscent. It was too obvious. It was everything that I'm not a huge thriller mystery reader or horror at all, but everything in here is stuff that I'm like, I feel like I've read this story a million times. There's literally nothing new or interesting about this, and I just found it very boring. So I don't know what to rate it. I finished it this morning, and I'm just sort of like, my enjoyment level of this is a 2. Usually I reserve like 2-star books for books that I think have big issues, and that's not necessarily the case here. I don't feel like this is a poorly constructed book, but I did not like it at all. So 2.5? I'm disappointed, but oh well. I feel like Riley Sager is to thrillers what Colleen Hoover is to romance, where a lot of publishing dollars are behind him and they know how to hit the story beats for their genre, but there's nothing really about it that is super compelling for me personally, and it's not the type of thrillers that I want to read, and that's sort of how I feel about Colleen Hoover. Like, I don't really have any beef with her personally. She's just not, I don't really like her books. I don't like them. They're just not for me. So anyway, moving on. So now let's get to the books that I am currently reading. So I just picked this up for my audio for today, Once Upon a Broken Heart. This is another YA fantasy romance. I've heard nothing but good things about this. Everybody loves it. I started it this morning in my audio format. I'm this far into it. I'm really, really loving this. This is basically like our heroine. This is a fantasy world, and I'm not entirely sure what exactly is happening in the fantasy world. It feels a little bit almost like it's Alice in Wonderland-esque type of way, but I don't think that's entirely true, or maybe not true at all. I'm still trying to get a grasp on the fantasy world, but I do like the characters. I like the pacing. It's basically our heroine opens up and the boy that she loves is going to marry somebody else, and she's convinced that he's under duress doing that he still loves her and that she's trying to put a stop to this wedding. So she goes and meets, I believe is it the Jack of Hearts? Prince of Hearts. The Wicked Prince of Hearts. See, that's why I think it's like an Alice in Wonderland, but I'm not entirely sure if it is or not. She goes to him and asks for his help, and he asks for 3 kisses to be given at the time and place of his choosing. But in order for her to do that, she ends up going to stop the wedding, and when she tries to stop the wedding, it turns all of like it's actually her stepsister who's marrying the boy that she loves, them to stone. And so to sort of reverse that, the spell gets on her, so she gets turned to stone. So then she ends up getting woken up like 6 weeks later, and she's trying to figure out like what happened and, you know, does this boy actually really love me? So it's very interesting. I'm liking it. I'm having a fun time. I'm sorry that explanation was a little bit not great, but I'm still sort of trying to wrap my head around what's going on in the plot, even though I am almost 100 pages into it. But I'm liking it a lot. Great writing style, very consumable. It's just fun. This feels like peak YA fantasy to me, and I love that, so I'm enjoying it a lot. And then the book that I'm physically reading, after I finished How to Tame a Wild Rogue, I wanted to go back and just binge the whole series. So I'm reading on my ebook, on my Kindle, the first book in the series, which is Lady Daring Takes a Lover. And this is how the Palace of Rogues begins. So basically, Lady Daring is the widow of an Earl, and she is impoverished now that he has died. He has left her with absolutely nothing. He died in deep, deep debt, so everything was taken from her, and she's basically like cast into poverty almost, except for he left her this abandoned old whorehouse down by the docks, which she then turns into the Palace of Rogues, this very beautiful, cozy boarding house. But she ends up going into business with her dead husband's ex-mistress, and it's just really fun. It's very fun so far. The hero's name is Captain Hardy. He's like a naval officer captain who's trying to find like who is selling or dealing like cigars that are like contraband or without taxes or something like that. And so he's investigating the Palace of Rogues because he believes it's the late Earl who had something involved with it. So that's the romance that's evolving there. It's just delightful. I love Julianne Long. Like, seriously, it's just a good time. So I'm about 40% into that. That's what I'm reading, and hopefully I will finish that this weekend and have an update for you next week. So, all right, my friends, those are all the books that I have read, what I'm currently reading, and what I hope to get to next, I don't really know. I'll probably, for my next ebook, I plan to just continue reading on in the Julianne Long series, so I'm sure I'll move on to book 2. As for my next audiobook, I'm not entirely sure. We'll see. We'll see what my library has come available for holds. And, I am going to be reading Aragon by Christopher Paolini. This is going to be a reread for, like, the 10th time. I read this years and years and years ago, loved it so much, and me and Jen from the Book Refuge are going to be buddy reading that probably next week, so I'm excited about that. So yeah, I'll have an update for you on that. That probably will be my next audiobook, so. Alright friends, thank you so much for watching, for making it this far. If you have made it this far and you want to leave me an emoji, please leave me some type of lizard. I don't know why. I've never asked you for a lizard before, and I'll see y'all in my next video.